So welcome to today to our presentation on the autumn statement, which was announced yesterday. Our briefing note came out last night at about 6:15. So if you haven't received it, it's not in your inboxes, just check for that. That should be around. So I'll start off looking at the statement itself. Then Dan's got quite a lot of really interesting analysis about council tax, about core spending power, and that kind of stuff. And then we'll finish off just looking at the settlement and looking at the future settlement and the modelling as well. I was updating the MTFP model. So in terms of kind of the way we'll go through it, just pick out some initial reactions to the autumn statement from some of the people at the IFS, Resolution Foundation, and some of the representative bodies, but then go into the meat of it, looking at what was in the statement, the wider economic and fiscal analysis, and then sort of driving down into the detail of the allocations that have come through for local government. Because it really was a much better outcome from the autumn statement yesterday than I think anyone predicted or even hoped, really. Even some of the good indications that we had coming out from within Whitehall were not as good as what we've actually received yesterday. So generally, I think we can say it's much better than we could have expected. Then once we've go into that detail around local government, Dan will look at council tax and core spending power. Then we'll come back to look at the settlement and the model. For those of you who haven't seen the links, this is how to get through to the documents on the autumn statement on the Treasury website, and then the more detailed backing papers and forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility as well. Both those parts are really worth having a good look at. So a few bits of initial analysis from the IFS and from the Resolution Foundation from what they issued last night. I think both those bodies have got big webinars on this morning, so the real detail from their analysis won't be out until later this morning. But just picking out some of the things that people like Paul Johnson and Torsten Bell said last night. And some of the things we obviously didn't pick up in our briefing note because we're much more focused on kind of the fiscal position and the local government. But a lot of the commentary really has been around the impact on household incomes and that it will be the biggest fall in household incomes in real terms for generations. So quite a sharp and sustained, it's quite a big kind of hit to the country's wealth. A lot of that is around the impact on debt interest rates rising for the public sector, and increasing the cost of servicing debt. Paul Johnson was talking about how the Chancellor has gone for a more relaxed fiscal mandate. He's no longer looking to balance the current budget, and he's pushed out the point at which he wants debt to start falling to 5 years. So I think this is a big theme that we'll see today, which is that the Chancellor really has kind of pushed back to much later in the kind of forecasting period when he expects to start really balancing that budget and bringing debt down. So in that sense, although a lot of this fiscal tightening is really quite severe, it doesn't really hit for quite a few years. It is very much backloaded, with most of the spending cuts not really hitting until April 25 and afterwards. I think a lot of commentators, I think both Paul Johnson and Torsten Bell here, saying that the spending plans after 2025 are so tight that actually they stretch credulity. There's a lot of kind of, I guess, disbelief that they will actually be ever delivered. So things have worsened quite a lot since March. The overall impact of the measures, the fiscal tightening measures, about 54 billion. As we said in our note yesterday, about half is from spending cuts and about half is from tax increases. One final point that Paul Johnson makes is that to achieve the fiscal rules that the Chancellor now has, on these forecasts, there's only headroom of 9 billion compared to 34 billion of headroom back in March. So things are much worse, and the forecasts and meeting those fiscal rules is much tighter. So there's a lot of risk involved in these forecasts. Torsten Bell and the Resolution Foundation said that the autumn statement was a combination of the rhetoric of George Osborne and the policies of Gordon Brown, for those of us who remember what they looked like. I think when he meant Gordon Brown, I think what he was talking about was, biggish increases in tax that were hitting the better off, and then spending cuts some way further down the line, which were never quite achieved. But similar sorts of points from Torsten Bell, talking about significant spending cuts being penciled in, but unlikely to be delivered on the scale envisaged. From the representative bodies from local government, focus mostly on the county councils network, and I think a lot of their lobbying probably really helped the sector to get the settlement that it did. And I think, just to sort of praise what's in there, is that I think they felt that the settlement that we got yesterday was better than had been expected, much better than was expected. And actually, they could support it fairly wholeheartedly. That doesn't mean to say that there were problems with it, or that local government won't be under a lot of pressure, particularly in non-care services. There's still lots of unfunded pressures within local government. And also some leaders in counties and obviously elsewhere as well will be reluctant to increase council tax by the full 5%. It's not just a given that everyone's going to go and do that. And more work will need to be done from 25-26 onwards to fund any shortfall, because there's no further known funding after 25-26, and the pressures will still be on local government. The local government association itself wasn't sure that council tax is the right solution to meeting long-term pressures in local government, and whether that's the right way of actually dealing with things like social care, child protection and homelessness, just because it obviously, as we know, it raises different amounts of money in different parts of the country, and that's only partially dealt with through equalisation. So looking now at the economic and fiscal analysis, starting off looking at gross domestic product, and you can see here from this chart that the reduction in the forecasts for GDP is at the heart of why there's had to be such a large degree of fiscal tightening over the next couple of years. You can really see how that the forecast for GDP has kind of fallen off the edge of a cliff really in 2022 into 23. The OBR is forecasting that we are in recession at the moment, and that there will have been a reduction in GDP in the second half of this calendar year, and that the whole of next year will have a reduction in GDP for the full 12-month period. You can see then that it does bounce back in 24 and 25, and actually in some respects the growth rates from 25 onwards are actually higher than we might have expected, and I think indeed we're higher than the kind of the trend rate that was assumed in the spring statement and in the spending review last year, slightly above that rate. So I don't know how credible that is, but you can see the forecast that the Bank of England was using earlier this month, which is actually more pessimistic than that's being used by the OBR. On one hand, that the OBR is more optimistic will have been welcomed by the Chancellor, because it's meant the fiscal tightening has not had to be quite as severe. But we do need to just bear in mind that maybe the Bank of England's right, maybe it should have been more pessimistic. I think that's where some of the really big risks will lie. And the other story, of course, is around inflation. And you can see there, the two things that are really, I think, fascinating by the numbers that came out from the OBR yesterday. The first was obviously the thing that we probably knew more about, which was that the peak in inflation will be higher this year and next than was anticipated 6 months ago in the spring statement. So you can see there that peaking in the current financial year at 9.1% rather than 7.4%, and that inflation persisting for another year as well. But it's what happened after that I think is quite interesting. The OBR is forecasting that inflation drops really very quickly in 2024 and actually would go negative in 2025. I think the commentary on this has been that the issue here is that maybe the OBR thinks that the stance the Bank of England's taken is maybe a bit too hawkish in terms of interest rate increases. We'll wait and see. But anyway, I doubt it would go quite that way. And I think the risk for us possibly is more that inflation persists a bit longer than the OBR has got in its forecast here. But clearly, this is the thing that's driven the recent problems with the economy and with the public finances. So the fiscal rules that the Chancellor adopted yesterday, the main one is that debt should be falling as a percentage of GDP by 2027-28. So that's year 5 of the fiscal plan. And then the supplementary target is that public sector borrowing must be under 3% of GDP. I think it's the weakening or the loosening of these rules that Paul Johnson talked about is from one that the point at which debt has to be falling has been pushed out an awful lot to year 5 rather than kind of year 3, which I think the previous rules had. And then the supplementary target previously used to be that current spending should be funded from current taxation, whereas this allows ongoing borrowing to fund spending, which is obviously a looser kind of target. Again, Paul Johnson, we do use him a lot for kind of to be the oracle on these sorts of things. Talks about the increases in taxation being equivalent to another 1% of GDP over the next 5 years, that being the highest in 75 years. So kind of continuing that story that kind of started really with the spring statement of this year about just how high the levels of taxation are and will be, and will, as you can see from this chart, will persist at that sort of level well into the medium term. So it's almost like this is the new normal, this level of taxation. It's gone up from 37.7% of GDP before the pandemic, and it's kind of settling at about 41% over the medium term now. So it's a big change. It's leveling out at about 41%. And then after that big peak in spending in 2021 with the pandemic, that has subsided to some degree in the last financial year, but it started to increase again in 22-23, particularly as things come through like the cost of managing debt, the increased interest rates, and also the cost of the energy package. So spending is, there's a lot of pressure on spending, as we know. Then public sector net borrowing, or kind of the deficit, the annual deficit for the public sector. We can see here that second peak in the deficit in the current financial year after the major one from the pandemic, the one in the current year driven largely by debt interest payments, but also by the cost of the energy support package as well. And again, looking a bit further forward, I think what's interesting is the level at which borrowing levels out. It levels out at around 70 to 80 billion pounds, which is higher than typically in the past. Chancellors have kind of like been happy for borrowing to level out. So you can see, going back, the red line's certainly the dotted red line, going back to the autumn budget 2018. The expectation under Philip Hammond, who was Chancellor then, was that borrowing would level out at about 30 billion, 25, 30 billion. And even under Rishi Sunak, in the spring statement earlier this year, he was kind of expecting borrowing to level out at about the same sort of level, 30 odd billion. Now it's kind of leveling out at a higher kind of level, which I think it shows how difficult it is to get borrowing under control, but also shows that margins are really, really tight. As the IFS has commented, headroom's only about 9 billion now, which is much less than headroom's been in previous years for previous chancellors. So there's a lot of risk there, a lot of stress on the numbers. Debt interest payments is one of the big things that has really pushed up expenditure and put that pressure on the public sector finances. So that significant, huge spike in interest payments, up to 120 billion in the current year. That's 37 billion pounds higher than was forecast back in March. That's equivalent to about 4% of GDP. But you'll notice that even in 27-28, payments are still forecast to be around 100 billion pounds. So, although they do jump around a little bit, they are forecast to remain at a really elevated level for the medium term, for the foreseeable future. Then debt as a percentage of GDP, you can see how things have moved around here with the pandemic. Actually, things turned out after the pandemic a bit better than people thought. Then we had the cost of living crisis, and that's pushed debt back up again. So the solid black line shows you the autumn statement forecast. So you can see there that it is forecast to keep increasing from about 85% of GDP up to just over 95% of GDP. But you can see there in 27-28, debt, it levels out over the next 4 years, but it doesn't really start to drop. And in fact, it only just starts to drop in 27-28. So the Treasury is only just hitting its primary fiscal rule, of having debt falling as a proportion of GDP by year 5. It only just achieves it. So it just shows how hard they've had to really struggle to get the numbers to come down. Then for spending, and we're looking at total managed expenditure here, which is departmental expenditure limits plus annually managed expenditure. Again, you can see how forecast spending levels have kind of jumped again. You can see the spike for the pandemic, but then you can see again a further spike in the current year as the cost of debt interest payments and the cost of the energy support packages and the other pressures start to come through. The other point to make about the current financial year is that it's the first year of the 3-year spending review, and actually it was a pretty generous year. The Chancellor gave away quite a lot of money in the current financial year, so quite a lot of things happening to really push up spending in the current financial year. Further ahead, spending does drop back a bit. Some of the temporary stuff, temporary support packages do drop out, and it's at that point where, as we'll see in a few minutes, that's where a lot of the pressure comes through onto the public spending. A lot of really quite tight spending settlements from 25-26 onwards. But in the next 2 years, there's no new money generally for public services. We're slightly different with social care, but generally no new money. Departments will have to make efficiencies to deal with inflationary pressures in the next 2 years. One last thing on the spending proposals, just want to look at a few other highlights. The energy support package increasing the cap to £3,000 with more means testing support, so a less generous support package, but nevertheless still expensive. Schools, additional funding was announced. Not something we look at that much these days. We used to look at schools funding a lot when it was more of a kind of a corporate funding stream, but it's worth just mentioning that Treasury has put quite a lot more money back into schools for the next few years, £2.3 billion. Benefits and pensions will be uprated by 10.1% in line with CPI, and the pensions triple lock remains. And for those of you with HRAs, social rents will be going up by 7.1%, so slightly less than the CPI that would normally be in place, but probably better than some of you were expecting. So looking at those spending projections, looking a bit further ahead to 25-26 onwards into the next spending review period. And what's quite clear here is that the settlements that we're going to get from 25-26 onwards will be less generous than we've had in the current spending review round. So in the current spending review round, real terms growth in funding went up by 3.4%. And for other or non-protected services, including local government, that was a 3.5% real terms increase in funding. So as we said earlier, it was really quite a generous spending review round this time round. But looking further ahead from 25-26 onwards, the implied increase in funding is much, much less generous, only 1% real terms growth. And once you take out things like the NHS, defence, etc., that declines to a 0.7% real terms cut in funding for other non-protected services, including local government. So that's much worse than the current spending round, and much worse, I think, really than we'd expected, to be honest. I think so one caveat on that, I think, though, is that I think adult social care is a slightly different category now. It's not quite the NHS, but it's pretty clear that ministers know they have to keep funding adult social care, and I can't imagine that adult social care will be seeing real terms cuts in funding from 25-26 onwards. But for the rest of the sector, I think that's what we can expect. In our modelling, we'd assumed cash increases in SFA and other grants of 2% from 25-26 onwards. That's probably a bit too generous. I think we could assume something more like 1 or 1.3% in cash terms, something around there. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. Then also just put in this autumn statement in the context of other spending reviews in the past. And you can see here, just looking at different measures of spending, but they give pretty similar answers. And you can see there that the worst two spending reviews were the 2010 spending review and a bit better than that, the 2015 spending review. They were the worst two, as I'm sure we will all remember. But the forecast spending review for 25-26 to 27-28 is only just better than the 2015 spending review. So we're not going back to the austerity years of George Osborne and how bad things were for much of the last decade, but it's not that much better, and it's certainly no better than it's certainly not nowhere near as good as the spending review for 2021. You can see there on the right hand side of that chart, the SR21 spending review was kind of right out at the far side there, much better even than the spending review in 2007 and the spending review in 2004. They're kind of almost the spending reviews you think of as being the peak years of Gordon Brown's growth years. So it just shows you how good the current spending round is, but also puts in context what's likely to happen in the spending review after that. Taxation increases. We know here that these have been going up for a couple of reasons. One is, we know that a lot of the rates are going up. Lots were announced yesterday in terms of rate increases. The spring statement had some quite big increases in rates as well. Income tax, corporation tax, and at the time, national insurance contribution increases. There was quite a big boost to taxation revenues earlier in the year, in the March spring statement, simply because of the effect of inflation on those revenues. They go up in nominal terms as inflation gets higher. But then as the economic troubles start to bite and the economy starts to contract, obviously that will then reduce the amount of tax revenues that the Treasury can expect. But nevertheless, you can see here a big step change in the current financial year and into the future in the amount of taxes that the Treasury will collect compared to what we would have expected before that. So, almost quite a big inflection point in the current year in terms of national taxes. I won't spend too much time looking at those specific increases. They're not necessarily directly relevant to us in local government, but obviously it's important just to be aware of what's going on. Generally, the Chancellor has tried to put the tax increases on to people who've got the highest income. So the top income tax rate, the threshold for that has dropped from 150 to 125,000, changing the dividend tax allowances. But generally, the thing that will really generate the most amount of future revenues is by freezing the thresholds. So they're being frozen right out to 2027-28. And that does affect a much broader range of people, not just those with the highest incomes. Then a range of other increases around personal capital gains, business capital gains, windfall profits, etc. But I think the thing that was most kind of relevant to us is the business rate package that was announced, which actually wasn't an increase in rates, but actually was the opposite. £14 billion business rate package to minimise the cost of business rates to businesses with business premises, the so-called bricks sector rather than the clicks sector. Top of the announcement was that the 2023 revaluation is going to go ahead as planned. I think some of the draft rating lists were published yesterday. I've not had a chance to look at them, but I will do so next week. So this scheme, this package worth 14 billion, a range of different things within it. A more generous transitional relief scheme doesn't affect the billing authorities in terms of you retain rates. It just means that the transitional support scheme is more generous to businesses. Extension or an increase in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector relief package costing 2.3 billion. But for us in local government, we'll be compensated, I'd imagine, in the usual way through Section 31 grants. And then a 3-year support package for small businesses, less costly, but directed there at smaller businesses. And again, we'd expect local government to be fully compensated in the usual way. But the big thing that we were looking out for was what would happen to the multiplier. We were fairly sure that it would be frozen, just because the increase, if it went up with the CPI inflation factor, would have been very, very costly to businesses. So that's been frozen in 23-24. The cost of freezing the multiplier in the costings yesterday was given as 1.7 billion and then rising in future years. That's an estimate of the net cost to the Treasury, so it includes cap compensation payments to us in local government, consequential impacts on corporation tax, and then the government's own lost income. So it's not necessarily directly comparable with the amount that we would actually be given in the sector for our lost income and lost funding. So looking at cap compensation, and just showing you here on the right in the chart, the amount of cap compensation that the government's paid out in any given year, and the prevailing interest rates and the change in multiplier in each of those years. And you can see there that on the right hand side of the chart, the huge increase in the cost of cap compensation, and that's partly because inflation rates have got so much higher, but also because the multiplier has been frozen now for 3 years in a row. So that's very costly indeed. We don't yet know on what basis cap compensation will be paid. We're working now on the assumption it's CPI rather than RPI. So you remember, up until the current financial year, we've had cap compensation paid out on the basis of RPI. In the budget, I think it was the 2017 budget, we were told that cap compensation would shift at the next spending review down to CPI. It hasn't happened yet, so we're assuming this is the point at which they do shift down to CPI. Just pays out a little less than RPI, but I think that does meet the definition of what was said in the autumn statement yesterday, which was that local authorities will be fully compensated for the loss of income as a result of these business rates measures. And I think if we did get compensation based on CPI, I think that would meet that measure. I think we could say we had been fully compensated, but we wait to see the details. Then in terms of what that means for the cap compensation fraction, some of you will be familiar with this in our MTFP model. You can see in there what we're assuming for cap compensation, that fraction, into 2023-24. If it is based on CPI at 10.1%, we estimate the fraction would be 105 over 499. Sometimes the roundings kind of move here and there. I'll need to check that in a bit more detail, but roughly speaking, it's about 105 over 499. So that's a big leap up from where it is in the current year, 51 over 499. But that just reflects simply how big a leap there has been on inflation and how much that's going to cost. Then moving on to social care resources, this is where we really had the big increase in funding, some of which was expected, some of which was not. I think the thing that wasn't expected really was the new money, the 1 billion in 23-24, increasing to 1.7 billion in 24-25. So some of that will come through the Better Care Fund, and some of that will come through a new ring-fence grant. For the Better Care Fund, I'm not sure the degree to which in local government will actually see that money come through. I'd be surprised if it goes into core spending power and talk about going through the Better Care Fund. So we may never see it in CSP. It may just go straight through, pass through our hands and straight onto working with the NHS. The other grant, the ring fence grant, the £400 million one, I think it's more likely that would go through core spending power. That's ring fenced. I don't know whether there'll be any conditions attached to that, but we'll wait and see. Then the other big announcement was the decision to delay the adult social care charging reforms, which are due to be implemented in October 23, pushing them back for 2 years. Whether they actually happen in October 25 is another matter, but that's kind of pushed down the line really. But all the funding that was available next year and the year after for those charging reforms are now going to be used to fund ongoing social care costs. I would expect that money to go through core spending power. That's funding effectively that was already in Spending Review 21. I think it means as well that I think it implies very strongly that all the fair cost of care and market sustainability work that you would be doing, that will no longer go ahead, and the funding for that work will now come through be recycled through into this new grant that we'll get. So really, all the reform work that you were doing stops, and instead the money that was in the Spending Review for that reform work would come through as just general social care grant within the core spending power. And then a 2% increase in the social care precept. So we were expecting a 1%, that's what it was in the current year, going up by further percent to 2 percentage points, raising about £600 million a year. Depends how you deal with treat the tax base increase, but roughly at that sort of amount. And of course, the actual amount will depend on decisions taken by individual authorities. Then just showing a bit more detail about what the monies look like within social care, and a few questions to think about. The first one is, does the 2.3 billion, these are kind of based on questions that we've had over the last 24 hours really. The first one is, does the 2.3 billion pound grant in 23-24 continue? I think it does. It's in core spending power, funded from the spending review. I assume that continues unchanged into the next 2 years. Pardon me. Question 2 is the BCF element of the £1 billion in core spending power. As I mentioned, I'm not sure it is. We may never see that within core spending power. That element, I think, might just go through to the NHS or through our hands to the NHS. How will the new social care grants be distributed? We're assuming that they will be distributed using a combination of the adult RNF plus full equalisation of the 2% precept. That's pretty much the same way that all the existing social care grants have been distributed, more or less. So I'd imagine that's how they would do that again, and we'll put that into our model later today so you can see what that looks like. Is there a social care precept of 2% in both 23-24 and 24-25? It's not massively clear from the text, although it does say 2% per year, but it's very clear in the numbers. The 2% precept applies to both 23-24 and 24-25. So they're kind of the numbers in a bit more detail, so you can see how they would flow through core spending power. Some more thoughts about adult social care. There's a big cliff edge in overall funding in 25-26, but in reality, I think anything that's in 24-25 just gets baselined, and we're then looking for new funding in addition to that on top of it in 25-26. The delay or cancellation of adult social care charging reform, if it does resume in 25-26, then the government will have to find new funding for that, in addition to what we've had for just funding general social care provision. When would a new adult social care formula be introduced? I think it's too late for 23-24, although I know there have been talks about trying to revive that. I think we're really looking at that for 25-26. So I'm assuming that they will just use the existing adult RNF. Would there be any ring fencing or conditions attached to the new grants? Possibly with that £1 billion of funding from new money, and I know certainly the NHS are pressing for there to be conditions on local authorities that money is used specifically for discharges, but we'll see. And all that has consequences for how you deal with providers and what you were doing as part of the reforms and where that leaves all that stuff. Final little bit before I hand over to Dan is just looking at the Band D increases, and just for the avoidance of doubt of what's happening next year, it's 3% core increase or 2.99% core increase. We don't yet know what's going to happen with the specific pound increase or £5 or £10 increases for districts, fire and police. There was nothing yesterday in the autumn statement. I think we're going to have to wait for the final or the provisional settlement next month to find out what's going on there. For now, I just assume that every class has got the 2.99% core increase plus the same £5 or £10 increases that they had in the current financial year, and then a further 2% adult social care. Just putting this in a bit of context, you can see that the link with inflation has now very much been definitely broken. It was not far off in the period 17-18 through to 2021, but since then it really has become detached from inflation as inflation's dropped and then increased massively. So a big departure there, I think. But also a total 5% increase for the adult social care authorities is not that different from what we've had in the past. It's not like a massive increase relative to previous years. It's bigger than the current year, but you can see there in previous years to that, it's not that dissimilar. And another point about equalisation is that the precept is the bit that's been equalised throughout this period. There's been no equalisation of the core increase in council tax. Thought I'd have a quick look at the real terms Band D thresholds since 2010. You can see that in the early part of that period, we were having quite big real terms cuts in Band D. At that time there was a lot of pressure from the government not to increase council tax to freeze it as much as possible. Bigger real terms increases in Band D for the rest of the decade, and this is the first year we've gone back to a big real terms cut, and actually the biggest real terms cut in Band D that we've had over that period. But then indexing it from 2010 onwards, you can see in the early part, you see the black dotted line is consumer price index. The other lines are different classes of authority, and the red, the England average. You can see there that for the early part of the last decade, 2010 to 2015, we had big real terms cuts in Band D, didn't keep pace with inflation. Then there were big real terms increases, and you can see right at the end of that period, you can see that inflation takes off again, and over the entire period, 2010 through to 23, 24, we've had a slight real terms cut in Band D, both for the average and for each different class of authority. But in a longer scale, going back to 1996, we've actually had a big real terms increase in Band D, but let's not talk about that too much. And then finally, spending power, just to put those numbers through, we are expecting a pretty big increase in core spending power in 23-24 just because of the 5% council tax growth for social care authorities and then all the social care funding. Question about whether it's sufficient, but it's certainly a big increase in core spending power and actually quite consistent with some of the big increases in the very recent years. And I think in core spending power terms, by my calculation, I think that core spending power in 23-24 will be at about 99.5% of where core spending power would have been back in 2010, 2011. So in core spending power terms, I think we've just reattained where we were in cash terms 13 years ago. Not great. And Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you. Yeah.
Excellent. I think you're going to have to tap the slides on.
Yeah, I will do.
Yeah, so if you move on. Morning, everybody. So I won't dwell on this because Adrian's talked about a lot of it, but I think I also agree that it seems to have been fairly generally well received. I saw budget gap figures of between 3 and 3.5 billion touted beforehand, and with the 2.8 billion of social care and a bit more freedom on council tax, that would seem to meet the gap from yesterday's announcements. I guess the point I'll make, picking up where Adrian finished off, is that council tax is now still a big part of the system. It's about 60% of the system, and therefore really important that we look at it in more detail. If you forward on to one, Adrian, please. So this is not dissimilar to the graph that Adrian's just showed you. Previously, council tax from being about half, well, less than half of our funding, reduced in 13-14 as the tax base got reduced by council tax support, and government gave us grant for 90% of that, but then cut that grant by about 50%. So clever little sleight of hand, which means that our tax base reduced, and we've only got about a quarter of the funding for for what was benefits. But as council tax has increased steadily since 13-14, now is getting close to 2/3 of our funding power. But actually, I was starting to get a bit worried before yesterday that would go up and up and up. But if you move on one slide, Adrian, I've tried to project that forward in the 2 years with the extra 2.8 and 4.7 billion and extra bits of council tax according to the new referendum criteria. And in actual fact, funding is increasing very slightly at a higher rate than is council tax. So council tax gearing is actually falling slightly over the next 2 years. So they seem to have stabilised there. And I think there's a phenomenon where if council tax gearing gets bigger and bigger and bigger and funding gets lower, it becomes harder to equalise. So those with high tax bases race ahead of those with usually higher needs and low tax bases. Moving on one, Adrian. So looking at what that says for the settlement next month, I think, as we probably most would agree, that the government has exceeded the most expectations. Perhaps they set those expectations really low so that they might exceed them. But we've also got to remember that inside that is, as I think Adrian said, councils will have to raise council tax by 5% to reach these spending power figures in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and for many of you, just before ahead of an election. But actually, council tax still has large disparities in terms of tax base, some of which are being equalised out, but not all of which, and we'll talk a little bit about that if we move on one. So I did this slide last year, and actually it was based upon up till 2021, before last year's injection of extra funding, the extra spending review funding that was all given last year. And there was a clear inverse relationship, was contrary to levelling up ambitions, in that actually, this is upper tier authority, it's not quite so clear with districts, but those in the least deprived areas, rather, were getting by far the bigger increases in spending power since the settlement was frozen back in 12-13, and those most deprived areas saw fairly hefty spending power cuts. And that is all to do with equal cuts and tax bases. If we move on another slide, and actually when I looked at this last year in terms of the region and levelling up, and the challenge that the levelling up secretary at the time, who's come back and still is the levelling up secretary, had, is that regionally the northern regions have done a lot worse since settlement was frozen back in 13-14 than have the southern regions. If we move on, Adrian. But what we found last year, for the first time since the formulae were frozen, is actually there was a positive relationship between deprivation and spending power. And for the first time for a long time, although it was starting to happen, there was those in more deprived areas had bigger spending power increases than those in least deprived areas. And that was due, I think, largely to a lot of equalisation that was within the social care grant system, such that the grants topped up after the adult social care precept. The grants made good the funding that couldn't be made from council tax, and followed the old adult social care formula, so that was more beneficial to more deprived areas. And I think last year's £822 million of service grant distributed through the SFA formula also created a lot more funding towards the more deprived areas. And that was only so that the switching around of the levelling up is only really possible due to extra resources that were thrown in 22-23. If you move on, Adrian. And I guess before yesterday's settlement, there wasn't much anticipation of a lot of extra funding, but actually an anticipation it might put on taxpayers, which would have made it very hard to level up, given that authorities such as Wokingham, that have very high tax bases, can get a lot more than can authorities such as Knowsley's, which have very low tax bases. And just put some figures up here. In terms of, I always find these two very interesting, because Wokingham's the lowest needs authority, or it was when it was last measured. Knowsley was the highest needs authority. Just so happens that their council tax bandees within just about £1 of one another, but Wokingham's council tax income from that same bandee, and very not dissimilar numbers of properties and population. Wokingham's is almost not quite twice as much, and that's simply down to tax base, more band E's to H in Wokingham, lots of A's to C's in Knowsley, and also lots more council tax support in Knowsley, which is a reduction in tax base. So if you look at those years, the spending power changes are pretty eye-watering, particularly in those first, in the what I call the Pickles years, 26% reduction at Knowsley, only 1% in Wokingham. But you'll see from 1920 to 2023, Knowsley actually started getting an increase that was higher than Wokingham's, despite the fact that Wokingham still was doing very well out of council tax. And it's at the bottom there that the social grants, care grants that were introduced 4 or 5 years ago, but have ramped up, have been in the favour using adult social care RNF of those most deprived authorities. So Knowsley gets significantly more than does Wokingham, allowing its spending power to catch up. If you move on one, Adrian. So that's the same graph as I showed earlier, but for Knowsley and Wokingham. I mean, the first thing to note is, at the start of 11, 12, 13, before all the freezing happened, Knowsley did get twice the spending power per head than did Wokingham. But the red line shows the Pickles years, and authorities, high deprived authorities, which were very reliant on government funding, suffered equal cuts from much bigger starting points. When Greg Clark came in around 15, 16, 17, he put some equalisation back into the system, and that levelled off a little bit. And then since the social care grants have come up in the last few years, the more deprived authorities have caught back up. But if you see that black line, the least deprived authorities have seen spending power increase over time, but the most deprived still are lower than they were back in 11-12. So it's a little bit more about levelling off at the moment than it is levelling up, one might argue, if you were comparing where we are now with where we were in 11-12. Move on one, Adrian. So I think that's a little bit of what I've just said there. But it is that extra funding, the fact that there is extra funding, that has allowed the levelling up to happen. And if we move on one, I now turn to districts where there is no additional funding, or so it seems, and look at 3 separate districts there. Elmbridge, which has the highest council tax income per head, Lincoln, which has the lowest tax base per head and is my proxy for the Red Wall, more northern places, and Breckland, which has fairly high needs but has the lowest Band D per head. And again, you can see there that the impact of council tax is pretty marked there. The extra income from the 3% is going to be that much greater at Elmbridge if they choose to put it up by 3%, simply because they've got a reasonably high Band D, but more importantly, a very high tax base per head. Whereas Lincoln, though it's got a higher Band D than Elmbridge, has a significantly smaller tax base and therefore won't gather as much from the 3%. And again, that's reflecting spending power changes since 11-12. And I don't see as much equalisation potential there, although there is some. If we move on, Adrian. So I suspect that the equalisation, if it comes for districts, we'll have to look at the services grants, lower tier services grant, UM's bonus, the ones to watch in terms of ensuring districts there's equalisation there. But I suspect, as if the past few years is anything to go by, all that might happen is that there'll be a minimum increase that all districts get. So they've, in the last few years, everyone's had at least a 0 increase in spending power, but not a loss, assuming they put the council tax up. But it doesn't equalise. It just means that some that might otherwise plummet, don't do so quite so much. So I think I would be more worried if I was a district with a low tax base and maybe not doing so well at business rates growth, and struggling on that low tax base. I would worry for them, particularly if they already have low levels of reserves. If we move on one. So it's clear from the budget that there's quite a focus on fairness and supporting the vulnerable, and the levelling up commitment is restated. So I expect to see the red wall areas get a bigger increase as they did last year and continue to do so. That would have been difficult with extra funding. Move on one, Adrian, please. I think there's enough money in the social care grants to more than equalise the impact of council tax. So I think we'll see definitely upper tier, more deprived areas doing better. But I'm not convinced that will hold true for districts. If we move on and very quickly whiz through these. So this is from the CTB one. If you move on again, sorry, Adrian. Yeah, move on again. So in terms of tax bases, looking at CTB1, we've got a council tax model which we'll be reissuing early next week for our members, but it looks at tax base and the CTB1 statistics as much as anything else. What you've got there is tax bases are recovering. They're recovering from the COVID year low in 2020 when there wasn't much building going on and there was a massive increase in council tax support. But the recovery is nowhere near the pre-COVID levels, and the recovery is largely due to falling council tax support at that point, that October. Now, I think as the economic slowdown and the cost of living crisis hits, you're going to see council tax support going back up, more people presenting for council tax support. I'd imagine you'll see house building subduing, and collection rates. It'll be interesting to see what people think about collection rates. And I think somebody asked about that in the chat. Collection rates might significantly decrease as cost of living really starts to hit, not necessarily reflecting figures just yet, but might be over the next year. And if we move on one very quickly, so the changes in tax bases, this shows, I'll leave them there, they'll be in the slides, shows that they're pretty much spread evenly, but largely because of reductions in council tax support. Move on another one, Adrian. For 2022, the information released last week, you got your largest gainers, the top 5 largest gainers: Birmingham, Salford, Leicester, and among. So that you might not have Newham as well. You might not have expected that. All areas that aren't particularly prosperous in terms of IMD, but they've had fairly large reductions in council tax support. So that's probably catching up. And the lowest areas, I'm not surprised at Arthursilly. I worked there for 2 years. Nobody's allowed to build anything at all. But some of those other areas, again, that they starting to show council tax support coming back up, and areas that might struggle and number of houses is going down. Interestingly, Adrian and I were talking at the start, Oxford and Lincoln, I wonder if that's something to do with Class MN exemptions for student towns, where houses tend to go across the students and they come off the tax base. That'd be an interesting one to look at. We've got the data to do so. Move on, Adrian. And yeah, just whiz through these. So it shows the change in tax base pre-COVID to now, and then I think I've got one final graph, but which is from October 14, from pretty much when the system was frozen. If you move on one, Adrian. Yep, and that's it. I think that's my last slide.
Great stuff, Dan. Oh, one more.
Which yeah, ignore that. I really enjoyed doing that slide, but in the end,
great. It looks good.
It looks great. It doesn't say much. So if you move on.
That's great. Cheers, Dan. Thank you. Last couple of slides, just pulling it together really, and looking ahead to the settlement. We're assuming now that it will be a 2-year settlement, or at least that when we get assumptions or we get an announcement for 23-24, that those assumptions effectively carry over into a second year, even if it's not formally a 2-year settlement. The additional social care funding next year and the year after does transform the settlement, makes it very different. I think one thing we were worried about was that there was so much pressure to fund social care that actually that might have resulted in some of the other funds within core spending power being top sliced. So things like services grant or lower tier services grant or new homes bonus, that pressure must be much less now than it was, given that so much money has come into core spending power for the next couple of years. 23 revaluation is taking place, so that will affect all the numbers in the provisional settlement next month. We'll update our model probably next week, actually, just to put some of those revaluation numbers through. It shouldn't, the net effect should be neutral on your bottom line, but you will want to understand how the numbers flow through the settlement. So my intention is to have that model available for you next week. Then the main areas within the settlement: 2022, 23 services grant. The future does seem to be quite uncertain. We're getting a lot of feedback about this from officials that are talking to representative groups that grant won't exist next year. That may well be the case, but I'd be fairly sure that funding would stay within core spending power. There may just be a different distribution of that funding. So I don't think it's going to go away. We won't lose the funding, but you may just not get it in the same format. They may try and do something along the lines that Dan talked about in his slides about levelling up or something like that. New Homes Bonus, the future continues to be uncertain. It is the great survivor, so it may keep going for another couple of years, but there are no further legacy payments after the current financial year. Lower tier services grant, again, we don't know the future of this grant, but the floor element within the LTSG is useful because it just makes sure that nobody gets a cash terms cut in core spending power. And for district councils who are losing New Homes Bonus, that's really useful. So it's got a good utility value, LTSG. The council tax assumptions, we know those, and we know the adult social care funding totals, but we don't yet know how that funding will be distributed. We'll update our model hopefully later today just to show you how we think that would happen and how the equalisation would take place for those grant allocations. Public health grant, in the spending review last year, it said the allocations for public health grant would increase with inflation. Given that inflation is so high, that seems pretty unlikely. Well, we've still got 2% in our model, but we'd need to know what they are at or around settlement time. When will it be? Obviously next month. It needs to be before the recess. The recess is the 21st of December. Heard quite strong rumours that is going to be the date. I don't know whether that they can actually know that this far out. Stuart can maybe advise, but that, certainly from a number of different sources I've heard that has been the date, and possibly with a policy consultation on the settlement in the early part of December. Don't know about any of that stuff, but for definite, but that's certainly what we're hearing quite strongly, and I'm sure others of you will have heard that from different groups where officials have been talking to those groups. Final slide. As I said, we'll try and update the MTFP model later today for things like the cap compensation, social care grants with equalisation, the new Band D assumptions, if possible get the CTB1 numbers in there as well, and revisions to projections for SFA from 25-26 onwards. And then if I can, we'll do the revaluation numbers and proposals next week with the new rating list where available. One last thing I haven't mentioned, which was, and I should have put it in here, was that there may be a clawback of the funding for the national insurance contribution increases. That was mentioned in our briefing note yesterday, and that was in the autumn statement yesterday. Not sure how much that is. Our estimate was about 400 million, but I've never seen a formal figure, and I don't know how much each of you got for that. But the Treasury have said they will claw that funding back, and I assume that will be clawed back by reducing any allocations of something like services grant. But we'll wait to see about that. So I think we're 1 or 2 minutes over, so we're nearly there, nearly on time, Dan, as our usual standard. So that's it for the slides. If you're not able to stay for the chat and the discussion afterwards, thanks for coming along, and good to see you. For everyone else, we should have half an hour now to go through some of these questions and issues in a little bit more detail. So, Dan, I think we've got quite a few questions, I think, haven't we?
Yeah, loads of questions. I don't know if Mike's got to go quite quickly, but I remember seeing this earlier on, this question as well. The rents, the social rents increase, some question as to whether it's 7% or 7.1%.
Sorry, that's me just being... That was the last slide I did this morning, I think, and I haven't checked it. So I think it is 7%. If that's what you've seen, then that's what it is. My apologies for that error on my slide. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah. There were loads of questions on social care, I noticed, as you were talking about that, some of which I think you answered, some of which we might need to go back to. So I'd suggest that to everyone that's still there, just unmute and shout if there's anything you want to look at whilst we scroll through the questions.
Actually, Dan, I was going to say, if Stuart, are you on the line still, Stuart? Was there anything you wanted to say about especially around the settlement and kind of the mechanics and the timings? Because I'm having an awful lot of chatter from people who've been talking to officials about dates and stuff.
Yes. So on dates, as you said, recess is the 21st of December. It would be odd if the settlement was that day, because there's special parliamentary procedures on a recess day, and there are normally no statements. And also it's seen as not good form to sneak it out on the last possible day. So that doesn't mean it won't be the day before, of course. And they may just be managing expectations to think long rather than short. There was very little content yesterday that was directly relevant. As you've listed a whole set of questions that have to be resolved, and maybe there are good ideas about how to do that, but between now and then they've got to agree proposals across a number of government departments and do quite an in-depth quality assurance of the figures, which can take at least a week, if not two.
Yeah.
So, although this
especially with the evaluation in there as well, I guess.
Exactly. It's very, very complicated stuff. I think we would expect a major theme of stability, which will and personally, I see no reason not to do a 2-year settlement. And the reason for that would be there isn't enough time now to do major changes in policy in time for this year's settlement. It is very difficult to do significant stuff even for next year. And the reason for that is that you've only got a single year's allocations. So you've got no forward trajectory to plan transition and so forth. And also it's quite close to a general election, which generally makes ministers a bit nervous. So, I think on the balance between stick and twist, my guess is they should be thinking seriously about a 2-year settlement.
Yeah.
And that's good for the sector as well, because even if you think you might do better next year, it's better to take what's on offer just now and then look at that over the coming year.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want me to cover, Adrian?
I guess there's quite a lot of questions that I noticed as I just flicked through them, Stuart, about whether the social care monies that have gone into the sector in the next couple of years, whether they get baselined or whether they're kind of like 2 years of one-off payments and then they drop out and we're back down again.
Yeah, so basically you need to have another spending review, before those decisions are made. So it's kind of a non-question at the moment. The assumption would be that they'll be baseline because the impacts of a cliff edge would be too horrendous to contemplate.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean they're not allocated in a different way or within a different policy context. It's a bit back to the drawing board on social care reform generally, but the issue is open for a future spending review at some point.
Yeah, and I guess it is the costs aren't going to go away, are they? The pressures aren't going to go away, and I certainly we've been modelling that any money that's in the core spending power for local government for social care in 24-25, that's the baseline for the following year. We're talking about increases on top of that, not that money going away.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's certainly where the department will start from. But the big issue that faces them, given what I've just said about the timing of reform, is basically, if you like, to lance the boil of reform. This has been kicking about for a long time, and it's there's a sort of sense that the policy perspective has moved on to other things. There are lots of non-reform announcements in yesterday's Awesome Statement. So how, given the timing of all this, what's the holding position over the period up to the general election for the kind of reforms that we've been talking about, updating the needs assessment, a really big one on reflecting the equalisation of the core. That's a significant effect, perhaps even more than the needs assessment for some authorities. And also, of course, the reset. Lots of authorities sitting on piles of accumulated growth.
Yeah.
And there is a commitment to recycle that from 2012, which actually says it will be done in 2020. So we're a little bit
a little way past
that on that now. They're going to need to have a good position on this in time for the settlement, which might mean something will come out sooner than that, as you say, just to simply kind of soften the way through to the main announcement.
Yeah, but as you say, it looks like 2 years of rollovers, and then I think you said before, Stuart, you know, the timing for then after doing the reforms, 25, 26, that's tricky. You know, then you push
Yes.
into 26, 27. It's, you know,
Yeah.
looking further ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it really does require a government that's both focused on it and has the capacity to carry through some quite divisive
Yeah.
reforms. You know, if you were to look at the impact of any particular set of changes, you'd find quite a variation between classes or regions. So, in other words, you know, if you looked at the North versus the South, or the counties versus the Mets, you'd find obviously an average outcome, but you'd find a big variation
Yeah.
in both of those. And that means you've got unhappy backbench MPs,
Everywhere. Yeah.
depending on their particular stance.
Yeah.
It's genuinely difficult to do without a large majority and without a cohesive majority, I
Yeah.
would suggest.
And it helps if your government lasts more than 49 days as well. That's always
Yeah,
that's a bonus, isn't it?
that's true. That's true.
There's a couple of questions coming up about the potential clawback of the national insurance contribution increases, and it's kind of a bit destabilising, really, because the Treasury said again they're going to claw it back, but haven't said how much, in what way, how does that work?
Yes.
You know, it's not just a question of. That's the one thing I think where the settlement's not just going to roll over from the current year to the next year. That's the one thing I think that could trip us up a bit.
Yeah, I don't have any information on that. It was never clear how it was paid out in the first place.
No.
So it is unclear whether and how it will be clawed back.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I put a number, maybe 400 million, but I don't know whether it really is. That was my back of the fag pack, I guess. What else have we got? Quite a few about revaluation, Dan, isn't there?
Yeah.
Martin, you were saying about about some of the changes there in revaluation as a result of what came out yesterday.
There's some about the 3 points, wasn't it, on 49, implying 6%.
Yeah.
On the multiplier. Trying to find it.
Yeah, I did see that as well. I think.
So Lindsay might have answered that. Actually, we asked do you look about the reference to 6% freeze on the multiplier, and this is the reply. Revaluation is the multiplier just to reflect not just inflation, but also expected appeals and changes in total RV. Without an intervention at the 23 reval, inflation would increase the multiplier by 10.1. So effectively, I think they're saying that they're building in revaluation changes to get to the 6%. It would have otherwise been the 10%, which was CPI, is it? Oh no, RPI.
Yeah.
So Lindsay answered that at 10:33. Thank you, Lindsay.
That's really that 6% was referring to the effects of revaluation and the change in the multiplier within the revaluation, rather than anything to do with the funding that we get outside that. What else is there?
About the care cap, and whether it's one-off or it will be baselined. I don't know if that gets picked up by what you thought and what Stuart confirmed, that it probably would be baselined, but it would be a matter for another spending review. Yeah,
that's what Stuart was saying, that would be the starting point for negotiations, but the expectation would be that it would stay in. But yeah.
Dave asked about whether 400 million is just for adult social care, or does it include children in care?
I think there was an answer to that. I saw one coming through after that. I can't see it now. Holly said, the Treasury document states that the 400 million pounds will be allocated. Just assume adults. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it?
And Stephanie sent a useful policy paper that seems to confirm that the 3% and the 2% ASC is up to 27-28. So it's 4 or 5 more years.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. I hadn't seen that actually, Dan. It's definitely, yeah.
Is that a Treasury policy statement, Stephanie?
It looks like it, doesn't it?
It's a snip of the policy costings document, so it is from the Treasury. Yeah. I mean, whether it means what it says, that we'll have up to 5% for every year for the next 5 years, I don't know, but that's what it seems to say.
That might be one of those things where the LBR, that's what they've used for their kind of forecasting assumption rather than actually being, what's going to happen, maybe.
Couple of quick points, Adrian. If the social care money goes through the social care grant, which some of it does, then that's an adults and children's grant and would be available for both. As far as the assumptions in the document are concerned, I think the document requires assumptions to be made, and so assumptions are made. It doesn't necessarily limit the government to those in the future. I mean, if there is a 2-year settlement, then it'll be clear what the assumption is for that period. But even that has to be revisited and come back to Parliament for approval in the following year. So it becomes a statement of best intent.
Yeah, and I guess the LBR needs a basis on which to do its forecast, doesn't it? And as a default, it would just project forward current policy, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you say anything else? If you want to just ask a question, if you have it, feel free to come forward as well. I'm just scrolling through. Another issue that was mentioned to me in a couple of emails yesterday was just about the fact that those with social care responsibilities, you started doing the reforms, you started engaging with providers, you started doing some of the work to get the cap going through. Where does that leave you? Is that sort of left hanging with providers? You left partway through those reforms. Oh, Anton, you got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I'm from North Yorkshire County Council, and I think that's a concern. I've put something in the chat there that we've all kind of been led up this path by the government as part of adult social care reforms. We've all done the fair cost of care exercise. Providers, as I said in my message, providers have already been in touch this morning saying, what a fantastic settlement you got yesterday. Can we have fair cost of care now? And actually, it's just about going to cover inflation for us. So we're a bit worried about, as I say again, the mood music around this, that it's certainly a better settlement than it could have been, but it doesn't really make any progress on the care market issues that we've got.
Yeah. So in other words, as you said, it covers those inflation pressures, doesn't do the market reform stuff that you were going to do, and the fair cost of care. Yeah. And I think the NHS as well are looking at this and thinking, that's great, that's going to solve our discharge problems.
Exactly. Yeah.
Someone else had a hand up, I couldn't quite see. Dave Shipton.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to reinforce what Anton said. It's better than we could have expected, but it's not going to avoid the need for some fairly significant sort of service savings elsewhere in the council.
Yeah.
It's failed, as I put in the chat, it's failed to address significant pressures we've got on children's services, significant pressures on homeschool transport. So we're going to have to give it's going to be a really difficult message to people. We're asking for increased council tax. At the same time, they're going to see service reductions. So it doesn't solve that problem.
I think expectations were raised with the reform package when it was announced, and then expectations raised again yesterday with more money than expected going through, and you're left trying to square the circle, aren't you? Actually balancing the budget.
Yeah.
And it still is, as your slide on council tax showed, that CPI and RPI have overtaken even the 5% increase. So all of those energy pressures, this year's pay award, they're all unanticipated. And So there's a deficit building up, isn't there, that has to be recovered even before you start looking at new pressures.
Yeah.
I suppose it's the districts that all go out in May 23, isn't it? I wonder how many people think their councillors will agree to the full 5 or 3% for districts 2 months ahead of a big set of elections.
Yeah. I think in the CCN document yesterday, they were saying there that some county leaders wouldn't go for the full 5% either. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess, Dan, the pressures are huge, though, aren't they?
Yeah, pressures are huge, but the cost of living narrative is just as huge, isn't it? In terms of Dave just said, are they going to be prepared to put up 5% at such a tough time if they're also cutting services or having to reduce services?
Yeah.
Difficult one.
Peter Mallock at South Cambridgeshire. Sorry, Peter. Peter Hockin. Go on, Peter. You come through if you're going to unmute yourself.
Yeah. From our Cornish correspondent.
Hey, none of your reviews from Devon. Thank you very much. I know there's another comment there just now. Just going back to the council tax again, and the fact that the OBR sort of forecasts have got the 5 years in at the 5%, but I guess we're not really going to know until the settlement. Maybe not even then, as to whether we should be building it into MTFPs perhaps for 23, 24 and 24, 25 maybe for those 2 years.
Yeah.
And then perhaps not assuming 5% go further going forward. I mean, whether members want to go with 5% or not is a different matter, but building in for our modelling, I think my thought is, are we just building it in for 1 year or 2 really at the moment? I don't think we'd be looking at the 5 at this stage. I think thoughts on that.
I think the 2 years is probably prudent, Peter. 5% for next year and the year after. I think that's pretty much built into the numbers as far as I can see. If you look at the numbers they announced on Social Care yesterday, I think assumed 2% precept for 2 years.
The second year,
yeah, I think so. I think after that, I think as Stuart said, it's probably more about modelling assumptions rather than any kind of agreed policy as such.
Yeah.
But maybe from 2025, 26 onwards, you revert back to 2% core and 1% precept possibly.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be far out with 5% either, I don't think.
Yeah.
From a district perspective, it'd be interesting because the 3% pretty much makes the £5 max redundant for the majority of authorities. There'd be a handful, I'd say, probably single figures now. So I know when I did some work with DCN when I was working for them, we sort of said, well, we should push for £10 maximum or 3%. But I think, I don't know, Stuart, the government always seems to be a bit reticent to do that. It feels like a super increase, but I'd imagine those districts that are sort of stranded on really, really low bandees, £5, which was enabling them to catch up a little bit. It wasn't catching up with those at the top, where 2% was much more than £5. But I still think that would be an easy thing for the government to do, is to allow those low bandee authorities to go up by £10, because it will be nothing compared to the 5% that their Shire County potentially puts on. It would be lost in that.
Yeah.
They've allowed police to catch up, but they seem really against that, or they have done whenever I've suggested it in the past.
Yeah, I had quite a few questions yesterday from fire and police as well as districts about what was the £5 or the £10 threshold going to be? Would they raise it? Would they not? I thought they were pretty vague yesterday about the different thresholds. I don't know whether that was because he didn't want to upset his backbenchers or whether probably more likely they haven't agreed it yet. So I suspect they haven't agreed it, and it's one of those things that is kind of can be haggled over quite a lot by the Home Office and DLUC and others about who gets to get a share of the council tax increase. So keep an eye out for that. Tony, I know Tony Glennon, your comment there is really interesting. On the radio last night, someone was saying that there was an expectation that 95% of councils would go for the full 4.99%. So suggest most would. I'm not surprised.
It'd be interesting because I suppose it'd be 4 years ago, wouldn't it, when that was on offer. as I remember, barely anyone did in London, and quite a few didn't in ahead of an election. But 4 years on, it'll be interesting to see if the election impact is less because the pressures are that much greater.
Yeah. Yeah, it must. I'd have thought it would be well. I'd have thought a no-brainer, but no, I'm not an elected politician. Yeah, and as Helen Smith reminds us, in Cumbria they've got council tax harmonisation to contend with at the same time, as though you're in North Yorkshire and in Somerset as well, which that can be make it more difficult. But it's also possibly a way of hiding a big increase, is it not? I don't know. What do you think, Wayne?
A lot of tough decisions, isn't there?
Still
lots of uncertainties, I think, surrounding some of this stuff, isn't there?
Yeah, a huge amount. And I think it's looking for something in the settlement. I think next month to see. I think a lot of things have been sorted out that we were thinking about. You know, to a large degree, you know, cap compensation, council tax increases. But some of those other grants, New Homes Bonus, I know a lot of people will be thinking, what's happening with New Homes Bonus? A lot of people are, you know, relying on that, especially district councils. Makes a big difference. And some of the rumours that are swirling around things like, you know, the services grant, kind of a bit unsettling. But I think a lot of the big pictures seems to kind of come together. The social care, I think, seems to have come together. It's some of the details that can make a big difference. Yeah, I think Peter Maddock as well. I was about to go to you earlier about the pay award. You'd heard about 2%. I'm not sure. I think I'd seen that 2% was what was in the current spending review for funding. I'm not sure about. I don't know, where had you seen that?
Yeah, I was just looking at something yesterday, and it almost looked like a throwaway comment, but obviously it's nobody else has sort of heard anything particularly. It just concerned me slightly that if that's still in the offing, because obviously we're in our MTFS, we're assuming something rather larger than that at the moment because of what's happening with inflation. But yeah, potentially it was just a couple of people speculating, as people like to do from time to time.
Yeah. Well, I know there is still a lot of speculation. We've added to that a little bit, but there is plenty of it going on. It's true, Peter. It's true. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. Cheers. I'm just kind of seeing if anything else that we haven't really wrapped up there, Dan. I think we might be more or less there. But anyway, feel free to come through if you think we have missed anything. But I think we're more or less there, actually. There's a few revaluation points there, but we'll try and be good fun to see the actual lists now and actually put them through the proposed formula that DLUHC have consulted on. We've got having a chat to them on Tuesday, I think, to see what they've got some more in store for us. So let's see what they come up with.
Adrian, will you confirm in your slides the rents whether it's 7.1 or 7? Because
yeah, I will. Sorry about that. I will double check, and I will put that in the. I'll update the slides, and I'll put the slides straight on our website in the events area section, so you'll see it there. But yeah, go by what's in the document, not what's on my slides. I think I've been a bit.
Pilots, do they continue in 23-24?
I think they must do, Martin.
We're assuming so in Cornwall, but haven't had that.
Yeah.
Officially confirmed, but
yeah. Your new mail will be furious in Cornwall if you don't get pilots.
Yeah. I think we might be, but I mean, they certainly have done, obviously, over the last couple of years on a year-by-year basis, continued them. But
Martin Mitchell, had you heard anything about the pilots? I mean, I'm assuming that it's a continuation of policy. There's nothing kind of different being said and it just should carry on. That's what I'd assume anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard anything formally. Again, our pilot's a bit quirky because we have this sort of 67% pilot in London, which is slightly different to the 100% pilots in the Mirror Combined Authorities in the West of England and Cornwall. But it'd just be nice for some confirmation about what's happening, because obviously if you start changing that, it has impacts not just on those authorities, but consequently throughout the system. So maybe that'll be set out in this paper. We're expecting the policy paper in early December.
Yeah, you heard that, Martin, that kind of policy consultation early December, then a provisional settlement kind of just before the recess.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, I think it sounds like other people have heard from briefings yesterday that 21st of December, which is the date Parliament rises, the last possible date, is looking like the target date. And obviously, in practice, that means probably a written statement at 12 and everything appears on the website about 5, 6 o'clock. So in reality, I think they just maybe they just do it to another GLA, because obviously we have to publish a consultation budget by law before Christmas. So it means we normally have to reflect the settlement, and we never quite have time to do it. So, but such is the way of the world. But
it is. Yeah, I think that's. I've never heard such strong briefings before about dates. Normally, officials are very reticent to say anything, but the senior officials definitely told a number of different treasurer groups. I think they told London yesterday about the 21st of December. So whether it actually happens that way, that's definitely what the briefing is. So I think we can take that as being the briefing. Yeah. Thanks for that, Martin. That's really useful. I think we're pretty much there, Dan. 11:30.
Yep.
Yeah. Great.
Everyone?
Yeah, perfect. So that's great. Thanks everyone for contributing. I will update the slides. Check the rent increases in the autumn statement documents. I'll try and get the model out later today if I can, but certainly we'll have updates during the week next week. Thanks for your time today.
We missed the 200 mark, Adrian, by 3. We were at 197 at one point. We'll just have
nearly
to
there.
The settlement will have to get 200 people to
That'll
it.
be the high water mark. Well, thanks very much for attending. Great to see you. Thank you, and speak to you soon. Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.